I think anytime someone is as creative as Marvin was, you're almost dealing with two people in one body. He always reached for the impossible, and that same drive, that was part of what led him to his end. It begins inside a dim, airless house in Sherman Oaks, where 2-year-old Anna Gordy sits folded in on herself beneath a faded yellow lamp. Her fingers, thin and unsteady, reach for a box she has kept hidden since the 1970s. The cardboard has gone soft with age. The tape is brittle, curling at the edges. Corners are crushed from decades of being moved from closet to closet, but never actually opened. Inside are letters, contracts, photographs, and fragments of a marriage the public never truly understood. For nearly half a century, Anna guarded these artifacts the way some people guard their sins. According to those close to her, she treated that box like evidence and confession all at once. And as she finally lifts the lid, something almost imperceptible shifts in the room. The air tightens, the silence deepens. The truth she has kept buried for 50 years begins to stir. Her voice is frail now, barely more than a whisper, but what she is said to have admitted is devastating. Marvin Gaye, she claimed, was not only destroyed by family tragedy, he was crushed by a system she helped construct, a system she silently allowed to devour him. So the question becomes chillingly simple. What truth did Anna Gordy carry for half a century, and why decide to speak if she truly did when there was so little time left? Behind the polished Motown sparkle, something darker had already started to rot. The story rewinds to a winter evening in Detroit, 1959, long before anyone dared to whisper the word legend beside Marvin Gaye's name. Back then, he was just a 20-year-old kid with a fragile voice, a thin coat, and a dream that felt too big for his hands. He walked into the Motown building on West Grand Boulevard with the hesitant steps of a young man who knew what he wanted but had no idea how to claim it. The hallways smelled of fresh paint and restless ambition. Typewriters clacked behind closed doors. Voices bled through studio walls. The Gordy family moved through the building like royalty, and everyone else learned to follow a few steps behind. Marvin wasn't just walking into a record label. He was stepping into a kingdom ruled by a single family. Standing close to the center of that kingdom was Anna Gordy, 37 years old, confident, composed, already sharpened by years of Motown politics. She wasn't merely Berry Gordy's sister. People around the label believed she was one of the quiet architects of the empire. The first time Marvin saw Anna, she was overseeing a photo shoot in Studio A. She stood with her arms folded, rings catching the studio lights, her voice calm but absolute as she gave instructions that were obeyed immediately. Something about the way people responded to her presence made Marvin look twice, and then he couldn't look away. Anna, in turn, watched Marvin with an expression that hovered somewhere between curiosity and recognition. She saw something in him others hadn't named yet, something raw, unpolished, and vulnerable, something she could, in her mind, shape. That was the first thread in a connection, built less on romance and more on power. Over the next few months, Marvin became a familiar figure in Motown's corridors. He rehearsed late into the night. He slept in friends' basements. He borrowed clothes for performances, chasing a sound that hadn't fully formed and a future he barely understood. Anna, however, always seemed to appear at critical moments after grueling rehearsals, after tense meetings. After Berry scolded Marvin for being undisciplined, she would quietly offer advice he hadn't requested, money he hadn't expected, opportunities he felt he deserved but couldn't reach on his own. Gradually, Marvin began to orbit her without realizing he had been pulled into her gravity. Years later, when she was believed to have revisited those memories at 92, Anna reportedly confessed that she had used her influence inside Motown to keep Marvin close, to make sure he remained dependent on her guidance, her approval, her power. By 1960, people inside the label were already whispering. They noticed how Anna seemed to control which rooms Marvin walked into, which producers were allowed to work with him, which projects moved forward, and which quietly disappeared. Sessions Marvin begged for were canceled with no explanation. Sessions Anna endorsed were approved almost instantly. And though Marvin couldn't see it yet, the structure around him was slowly shaping him into something fragile, a man whose career belonged not to himself, but to a network of people directing each step. By 1962, that dependency was nearly complete. Marvin's first check, small, irregular, filtered through Motown's accounting, passed through Anna's hands. She told him she could help manage his finances, and he accepted because he didn't understand the business and believed she did. She began handling his wardrobe, his travel arrangements, even his relationships with certain musicians. To outsiders, it looked like a devoted, hands-on partner supporting a rising star. But according to what Anna would later admit in private, she didn't want Marvin to grow independent too quickly. She wanted him anchored. She wanted him tethered. She wanted him hers. Then came June 1963, the wedding that quietly shook Motown's inner circle. It wasn't grand. It wasn't glamorous. It was small, rushed, and heavy with unspoken tension. Many around the label believed Marvin did not marry out of pure passion. They suspected he married because saying no might put his fragile position at a Gordy-controlled label at risk. The 17-year age gap fueled gossip. The business ties fueled accusations. But Anna didn't seem to care. She believed she had secured something permanent, a bond, a role, a claim. What the public never knew was that the marriage functioned less like a union and more like a contract. Letters Anna was said to have kept hidden for decades, only revealing them close to the end of her life, outlined a disturbing level of control. She allegedly dictated his rehearsal times. She filtered his phone calls. She blocked sessions with producers she didn't approve of. She managed his calendar, chose his wardrobe, approved his spending. She tracked where he went after shows. She made sure Gordy never pushed Marvin too far beyond her reach. And Marvin, already overwhelmed by new fame, responsibility, and the pressure of defining his artistic identity, didn't see the cage forming around him. By 1964, the fractures in his mind were visible to anyone paying attention. Marvin began drinking heavily. He disappeared for nights with no explanation. He shut down in rehearsals, eyes unfocused, voice tight. He wandered Detroit streets alone after midnight, hands buried deep in his pockets as if he could outwalk a feeling he couldn't name. Some Motown staff believed he was simply depressed. Others thought he was exhausted by the pace of success. But, according to what Anna later confided, she saw it differently. Marvin wasn't just depressed, he was trapped. Trapped inside a relationship that felt like a binding agreement instead of a refuge. The tension reached a breaking point in 1965. Marvin's hunger for creative freedom intensified. He wanted to experiment with new producers, new musicians, new sounds. He wanted to follow his instincts rather than the map laid out for him. But every time he tried to step beyond the structure Anna controlled, something often invisible, always effective, pushed him back. Sessions vanished from the schedule. Studio access was suddenly revoked. His calendar shifted without explanation. The more he tried to pull away, the tighter Anna held on. In private, Marvin began to come apart. He skipped rehearsals. He obsessed over every note, every performance, chasing perfection he could never achieve. He questioned his voice, his worth, his future. He drank not to celebrate, but to numb the suffocation he couldn't put into words. And as Anna would later acknowledge, she didn't try to understand his distress. She tightened her grip instead. She believed more control would stabilize him, that structure would save him. Instead, it pushed him deeper into a torment that would shadow him for the rest of his life. By 1966, the marriage was decaying from the inside. Marvin's eyes carried a constant unease. His movements slowed. His conversations grew shorter. He trusted fewer and fewer people. Anna, still convinced she could mold him into what she believed he should be, refused to recognize the damage she had already done. She kept the letters, the documents, the proof of her control sealed away in a small wooden box. And for nearly 50 years, that box remained closed until she reached 92. Until the world assumed she had nothing left to reveal. Until she was believed to have finally admitted that the marriage the public romanticized had never truly been built on love. It was built on leverage. It was built on control. And it marked the beginning of Marvin Gaye's spiritual collapse. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. The one secret meant to keep a marriage from breaking became the weapon that shattered it. It begins in the spring of 1966, inside the Gordy family home on West Boston Boulevard in Detroit. A house where curtains stayed heavy, conversations stayed guarded, and decisions that shaped careers were made behind doors that were never meant to open to the public. Marvin Gaye was 27. Anna Gordy was 48. Their marriage was already straining under the weight of age, power, and control. What had begun as leverage disguised as love was now cracking under its own pressure. And then came the moment where everything crossed a line that could never be undone. They wanted a child. Or at least, the world was determined to see them with one. In Motown, reputation wasn't optional, it was policy. It didn't matter what was real, it only mattered what appeared perfect. A few months later, in September 1966, a newborn boy was placed in Marvin and Anna's arms. To the outside world, it looked like a miracle had finally arrived. Newspapers captured the couple leaving a Detroit townhouse, their faces set in smiles that seemed almost rehearsed. Fans cheered, reporters praised the picture-perfect Motown family. But inside the house, past the camera flashes and congratulatory phone calls, a darker truth had already taken root. The baby was not theirs, at least not in the way the public believed. He was not born from their marriage. And according to accounts that surfaced later, he was not adopted through any traditional agency. The child, who would later be known as Marvin Gaye III, was said to be the biological son of Denise Gordy, Anna's teenage niece, only 16 years old at the time of conception. This was the lie that became the foundation of everything that followed. At 92, Anna reportedly finally admitted the truth she had kept buried for almost 5 decades. The adoption, she said, had been orchestrated within the family corridors, handled quietly, arranged in hush, finalized through Motown's internal influence rather than public procedure. The papers were signed in a back office on Whitney Street, away from Motown's official headquarters. No press, no witnesses, no cameras. Just a closed door, a stack of legal documents, and a man who could feel his life being steered by forces he couldn't fight. Inside the small wooden box Anna kept until her final years, there were said to be smudged legal forms, dates that looked altered, and handwritten notes from a Motown attorney suggesting the adoption should be sealed tightly for the sake of all involved. But the most unsettling piece was a draft of Marvin's signature on a form he appeared not to have wanted to sign. The strokes were jagged, unsteady, as if drawn by a hand shaking with anger or regret. According to what Anna later admitted, Marvin was pressured from all sides emotionally, financially, professionally, into accepting a version of fatherhood that didn't feel like a choice. Through 1967, the psychological fracture widened. Marvin loved the boy deeply, there was never a question about that. But the circumstances surrounding the child's arrival became a wound he couldn't close. Every smile for the cameras felt like betrayal. Every family gathering felt like surveillance. Every time the child called him Daddy, Marvin felt the weight of a life he did not fully control pressing down on his chest. The marriage, already fragile, began to bend under the strain of secrets stacked on top of secrets. By early 1968, people around Motown noticed the shift. Marvin walked through the halls with a heavy, distant stare. He drifted through rehearsals like a ghost. He stayed late in Studio A, long after everyone left, sitting in the dark, staring at the piano as if it held answers just out of reach. Engineers remembered him scribbling lyrics filled with betrayal, suffocation, and quiet rage. Others recalled seeing him pacing the halls with his head bowed, one hand pressed to his temple, whispering under his breath as if arguing with someone who wasn't there. What the public applauded as artistic depth, those closest to him saw as something else. A man unraveling. By late 1969, the collapse inside Marvin was no longer something he could disguise. His drinking intensified. He disappeared for days after shows. He drove through Detroit's empty streets until sunrise, headlights cutting pale tunnels through winter fog. On the nights he vanished, some believed he was trying to escape the Gordy influence. Others believed he was trying to escape himself. The truth, according to those who watched him closely, was simpler and far more devastating. Marvin felt trapped in a marriage that had become a stage set, a constructed image that no longer matched his reality. And at the center of that image was a child he adored, whose origin story had been turned into a lie. Then came 1970, the year Marvin tried to reinvent himself the only way he knew how, through music. He poured himself into songs that would later be recognized as some of his most emotionally raw work, early versions of what people would come to know as "When Did You Stop Loving Me" and "The Shadow of Your Smile." These weren't just love songs. They were confessions from a man drowning in contradictions, torn between loyalty and betrayal, identity and expectation, truth and performance. But nothing could prepare Marvin or Anna for what would unfold in 1971. During rehearsals in Los Angeles that summer, Marvin crossed paths with Janice Hunter, a young woman decades younger than Anna. Her presence hit him with a jolt of possibility. She represented everything he felt he had been denied: youth, choice, autonomy, a clean slate. Their emotional connection sparked at a moment when Marvin was already fractured. For him, Janice was not just a person. She was an exit sign, glowing in a dark hallway. And from the moment he stepped into that new relationship, his marriage to Anna began a slow, irreversible descent. Throughout 1972, Marvin split his life across homes, studios, cities, and women. On paper, he was still Anna's husband. In reality, he was dividing himself into pieces. He felt grateful to Anna for the stability she had once provided, but he resented the control she never fully loosened. He cherished the child she raised with him, but the buried truth about the boy's birth gnawed at him every single day. He was drawn to Janice for the escape she seemed to offer, yet he feared turning her into another dependency, another cage. By early 1973, the collapse was complete. Marvin spent more time away from the Gordy home than inside it. He wandered Los Angeles like a man trying to outrun a shadow only he could see. The secret born in 1966, the child, the lie, the sealed paperwork, the quiet coercion had hollowed him out from within. It pushed him toward decisions he might never have made in a life built on honesty. And the emotional war that followed between Anna and Janice, between Motown and Marvin, between his role as father, husband, and artist, became the foundation of the dark years ahead. In the end, the child was never the enemy. The lie was. And that lie became the first major fault line in Marvin Gaye's long road to destruction. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. Once the lie took root, everything else began to crumble slowly at first, then all at once. What followed was not just a marriage dissolving, it was Marvin Gaye stepping into a war he never fully saw coming until it was too late. It opens in early 1973, at a moment when, on the surface, Marvin should have been celebrating. What's Going On had already secured his legacy as one of Motown's defining voices. Tours sold out. Newspapers praised his genius. Fans treated him like a prophet. But beneath the applause, something darker was moving. The deception surrounding Marvin Gaye III had not only fractured the marriage, it had carved away at Marvin's sense of self. That vulnerability, according to people who watched the period unfold, created an opening for a far more dangerous conflict, one between Marvin and the very system that had once appeared to protect him. The first sign surfaced in February 1973 during recording sessions at Hitsville West in Los Angeles. Engineers recalled Marvin pacing the studio between takes, staring at the soundboard like it was a battlefield. He glanced at the hallway repeatedly, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment, someone from Motown, someone tied to the Gordy orbit, someone who had once dictated his course and might try again. He stayed deep into the night, humming melodies under his breath, rewriting entire verses, scratching out lyrics that hinted at betrayal, exploitation, fear. His songs were no longer just art. They were confessions disguised as records. That summer, Marvin moved into a new home in Santa Monica. The distance from Detroit was supposed to give him air, a chance to breathe outside Motown's shadow. Instead, new problems tightened around him. Bills piled up. His dependence on drugs increased. He drifted between bursts of manic creativity and stretches of crippling withdrawal. At the same time, his connection with Janice Hunter, the young woman he had met in 1973 at just 17, continued to grow. Their relationship, as many observed, shattered whatever remained of his marriage to Anna. The more Marvin tried to build a new life, the more Motown, in his eyes, tightened its grip. By late 1973, financial disputes erupted between Marvin and the label. Contracts he had reportedly signed years earlier under pressure, under emotional influence, under the weight of Gordy power came back to strangle him. Royalty statements didn't make sense. Advances arrived late. Money seemed to vanish into what he believed were accounting shadows. To Marvin, it felt as if every attempt at independence was met with unseen resistance. Then came the blow that pushed him closer to the edge. In 1974, Anna Gordy filed legal actions seeking spousal support, financial compensation, and a share of Marvin's future royalties. On paper, to outsiders, it looked like a typical divorce move. But to Marvin, it felt like an extension of the same machine. It was as if Motown, through the Gordy family, still had its hand in his pockets, still controlling his earnings, still punishing him for stepping outside the image they had once helped construct. His mental state deteriorated rapidly. Friends later described him as restless, paranoid, haunted. He spoke less. He slept irregularly. He locked himself in rooms for hours at a time. His drug use escalated until entire days blurred into each other. Even more damaging, however, was the growing conviction that he was being watched, evaluated, assessed. Marvin began avoiding phone calls altogether. He unplugged studio cables at night, convinced someone might be listening in. He canceled meetings without warning. In Los Angeles, he wore sunglasses even long after sunset, hiding eyes that flickered with exhaustion and suspicion. Then, in 1975, everything collapsed at once. Marvin's finances imploded. Debt stacked so high he could no longer pretend it wasn't there. He owed money to almost everyone around him: labels, lawyers, friends, dealers, even family. To escape collectors and pressure he believed was closing in, he fled to Hawaii for months. He lived in hotels under different names, leaving no forwarding address. Locals later recalled seeing him alone on Waikiki Beach at dawn, standing near the shoreline, staring out at the Pacific Ocean with an expression that looked less like peace and more like surrender. Then came the deal that would change everything. To settle his divorce with Anna, Marvin agreed to do something almost unheard of: record an album whose royalties would go directly to her. To many in the industry, it sounded like humiliation. It was whispered about, mocked, held up as proof that Marvin had been backed into a corner. But, according to those who knew him then, Marvin saw the album as something else: his last weapon, his final way of telling the truth, in a world where truth had always been edited or buried. That album became Here, My Dear, recorded in 1977. Here, My Dear was more than a breakup record. It was a war document. Every track was a coded message, every lyric a confession, every groove soaked in pain. Engineers later recalled moments when Marvin stood in the vocal booth with tears sliding off his chin and onto the studio floor. He poured into the microphone the anger he had swallowed for years, the lies he had lived, the control he believed he had endured. And he did all of it, knowing Anna would receive the profits, and knowing she would hear every accusation carved into every note. But instead of bringing closure, the album only unleashed more chaos. Anna was said to be devastated. Motown executives were reportedly furious. Critics were confused by its rawness. Sales were poor. And Marvin, already exhausted and unstable, felt as though the world had rejected the one time he tried to put everything into the open. By 1978, Marvin had lost nearly everything that had once anchored him. His money was gone. His family was fractured. His career was unsteady. His drug use hovered near its peak. He drifted between Los Angeles, London, and Amsterdam, trying to outrun debts and demons. He lived in rented apartments where curtains stayed closed and phones stayed off the hook. He believed Motown was still manipulating his trajectory. He believed someone in the Gordy orbit wanted to keep him in debt forever. He felt hunted not by a single visible enemy, but by a system that, in his mind, had swallowed his life for almost 2 decades. By 1979, the breaking point arrived. Marvin retreated deeper into Europe, convinced that the only way to stay alive was to stay far away from the industry that had built him. He recorded in fragments. He slept in broken patterns. He trusted almost no one. The voice that had once been Motown's most beautiful now carried the tremor of a man who had stared into the darkness and seen his own reflection looking back. These years were not just a fall, they were a transformation. Marvin Gaye was no longer the polished Motown gentleman in tailored suits and rehearsed smiles. He had become something else entirely, a man at war. At war with Motown, at war with Anna, at war with the truth, at war with himself. And that war was only preparing him for the final tragedy that would come next. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. When Marvin Gaye stopped running from the industry and started running from himself, the decline didn't begin with an explosion. It began with a silence that followed him from city to city, room to room, long, hollow stretches of quiet that felt heavier than any noise. By January 1979, living in a cramped apartment above the Voorbehal Canal area in Amsterdam, Marvin had become a ghost drifting through the frame of his own life. The cold Dutch wind rattled the thin windows. Damp crept along the corners of the ceiling. The phone rang and went unanswered. He avoided daylight whenever he could, stepping outside only after dark, wrapped in a long coat that concealed both his shrinking frame and the paranoia tightening inside his chest. According to people who crossed paths with him then, his eyes were distant, unfocused, as if he was listening for something no one else could hear. One pattern defined these years. Marvin kept moving because he believed staying still would destroy him. By the summer of 1979, he left Amsterdam for Ostend, Belgium, chasing the promise of isolation and a chance to rebuild. The house he rented looked out over the North Sea, waves slamming violently against the pier, echoing the turbulence in his own mind. He slept during the day and worked at night. He paced the floors with cigarettes burning to the filter, ashes falling unnoticed on the carpet. Neighbors later said they often saw him standing at the large bay window at 3 a.m., staring out at the pitch-black water, motionless for hours. His weight dropped, his face hollowed. Cocaine became both his crutch and his punishment. And beneath it all was the same pressure that had chased him since the mid-1970s, the financial noose of Motown contracts, the divorce settlement draining him, the debts multiplying faster than he could outrun them. By 1980, Marvin no longer trusted the air around him. In Los Angeles, creditors found him. In London, old associates surfaced with demands. In New York, promoters pushed for refunds for shows he didn't perform. Letters from lawyers arrived thicker than his royalty checks. He began unplugging telephones, insisting his conversations were being monitored. He told friends he heard cars idling outside at night. He slept in different rooms every few days. He avoided streetlights, convinced being seen too clearly was its own kind of danger. By late 1980, he drifted back to Los Angeles, a move he later described in private writings as a mistake. The house on Gramercy Place didn't feel like a refuge. It felt like a trap. The Gordy family was nearby. Motown's presence was everywhere. Every block reminded him of what he owed, what he feared, and what he could not face. At night, he sat alone in the living room, curtains sealed shut, turning the stereo loud enough to drown his own thoughts. Cocaine drifted through the house like dust. He slept on couches, on floors, often fully dressed, as if he might need to run at any moment. In early 1981, the IRS seized his income. That was when the spiral sharpened. Marvin started to describe his life in terms of battlefields, not as metaphor, but as reality. To him, the world had divided into enemies, allies, and escape routes. When he moved more permanently into the family home on Gramercy with his parents, his brother Frankie immediately noticed the shift. Marvin installed multiple locks on his bedroom door. Every night, he pushed a heavy bureau against it before trying to sleep. He stopped answering knocks, even when his mother called his name. He hid cash in shoes, beneath carpets, behind picture frames. He told loved ones he believed someone wanted to erase him financially first, so it would be easier to erase him completely afterward. By mid-1982, paranoia fused with anger. Arguments erupted inside the house over noise, privacy, shadows. Marvin insisted he saw moving outside his window. He became hypersensitive to every sound. A car backfiring down the street made him jump. A neighbor's slammed door sent him on edge. He stopped eating meals at the table. Days passed where he did not come downstairs. Cocaine magnified every fracture in his mind, heightening fear, sharpening suspicion, turning the house itself into something that felt like it wanted to swallow him. Then came the incident in San Diego, December 1982. After a show, Marvin became convinced someone was following him. According to accounts from that night, he climbed into the back seat of a friend's car and lay there, refusing to move for nearly an hour until he was sure the street was empty. No one was there. At least, no one anyone else could see. Marvin didn't accept that. To him, the threat was constant, unseen, patient, waiting. By 1983, he looked older than his years. His beard had gone gray, his movements slowed. He often sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, head in his hands, fingers digging into his scalp like he was trying to hold his mind together by force. He asked Frankie to unplug every television in the house. He tore apart drawers, searching for microphones he believed were hidden inside. He stopped going outside for weeks at a time. The atmosphere in the house thickened, like heat building in a sealed room. The final spiral began in March 1984, when Marvin's already strained relationship with his father turned combustible. Marvin Sr., strict, unpredictable, and long a source of fear and conflict, clashed constantly with his son. The house on Gramercy became a pressure cooker. One man fueled by paranoia and trauma, the other by rigid authority and wounded pride. Arguments escalated quickly. Doors slammed, objects shattered, voices rose and ricocheted off the walls. Marvin, emotionally raw and chemically volatile, responded with eruptions of rage that frightened everyone around him. On March 31, tensions reached a frightening peak. The argument between Marvin and his father was so intense that Frankie would later recall Marvin pacing, shaking, breathing hard like a man who knew a collision was coming and couldn't stop it. Marvin slept barely an hour that night. Then came the morning of the 1st of April, 1984. The house was strangely still. Sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, dust hanging in thin beams. Marvin's mother tried to keep the peace, moving carefully between two men who had been at war for most of their lives. A simple disagreement over paperwork spiraled into shouting. Old wounds resurfaced. Accusations flew. The kind of argument that isn't really about the words being spoken, but the decades sitting underneath them. Marvin, worn down by years of internal and external war, snapped. He shoved his father. Walls seemed to vibrate with the impact of everything they'd never resolved. His father left the room, shaking not purely from fear, but from something colder and harder. As Marvin walked back toward his bedroom, shoulders hunched, heart pounding, no one in the house fully understood that the next few seconds would end more than just a fight. Marvin Sr. returned with a gun he kept hidden in a closet. He stepped into the hallway. He raised his arm. He fired twice. The sound ripped through the house, echoing down the staircase, freezing everything in place. Marvin collapsed onto the floor of the bedroom he had turned into a bunker for almost 2 years. His last hiding place, now a crime scene. Blood spread across the carpet. His breathing slowed. In that single brutal moment, the chaos that had followed him for a decade, contracts, lies, mounting debts, paranoia, addiction, battles with Motown, battles with Anna, battles with himself, collapsed into silence. Paramedics arrived minutes later. According to reports, he was pronounced dead at 10:01 p.m., one day before what would have been his 45th birthday. To the outside world, it looked like a sudden domestic tragedy. One violent outburst, one gun, one broken family. But to those who had watched the slow-motion collapse, it was something darker. The final strike in a long chain of damage that had begun years earlier. Marvin Gaye didn't truly die on the 1st of April 1984 because of a single argument. He died because every ghost he had been running from finally caught up with him at the same time. When the last person who knew the whole story finally opened the box, Motown hoped would stay sealed forever. It did not happen on a stage or in front of cameras. It happened in a quiet room, behind drawn curtains, with almost no one watching. It begins in October 2013, inside a modest Sherman Oaks home where the air felt heavy, and the walls were lined with reminders of a life the music industry had largely moved on from. Anna Gordy, frail, soft-spoken, and nearly forgotten by the system she once helped shape, asked a younger relative to bring her a box. Until that moment, no one else in the family even knew it existed. She simply lifted one trembling hand and pointed toward a closet she'd kept locked for decades. Inside was a small wooden chest, dark and polished, its edges worn smooth. She had hidden it since the 1960 seconds. And now, for the first time in 50 years, she opened it. She said she couldn't carry these secrets any longer, not at her age, not with the end so near. Because they weren't just secrets. They were, in her own words, the map of how Marvin's life had really fallen apart long before the gunshots of the 1st of April 1984. Inside the box were contracts with yellowed corners, letters with edges singed or burned, bank slips, unsent notes Marvin had written, legal drafts marked up with edits in Anna's recognizable handwriting. But beneath the papers were objects that felt even more unsettling. An ashtray from Marvin's Amsterdam apartment, a hotel receipt from one of his disappearances in 1980, a torn Polaroid from the early 1970 seconds of Marvin staring blankly into a mirror, a small envelope marked only with his initials. Each item felt like a puzzle piece from a life that had never been fully assembled in public. With her hands shaking, Anna began to speak. The first confession was quiet, almost swallowed by the room. Marvin's psychological collapse, she said, did not begin with drugs, or fame, or even the lie about the child. It began with Motown's grip, a grip she now admitted she helped enforce. She revealed that Marvin's early contracts were structured to keep him dependent both financially and emotionally. She said, Berry Gordy warned her in early 1962 that Marvin might try to break away, and that she needed to help keep him focused, a word that, in practice, meant contained. She admitted using her influence to restrict who Marvin worked with, who he befriended, where he recorded, and how often he was paid. She claimed that one of Marvin's deepest frustrations in the mid-1960 seconds, his inability to record certain projects, came directly from choices she and Motown executives made behind closed doors. The second confession cut closer to the bone. Anna had seen Marvin's mental state slipping years before anyone on the outside suspected a thing. She described nights in 1968 when he came home from the studio, shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak for hours. She remembered him sitting on the floor of their Detroit home, knees pulled to his chest, breathing in short, shallow bursts, mumbling about pressure and being boxed in. She said he often tore up his own lyrics not because they were unfinished, but because he feared that telling too much truth in his music would get him in trouble. The family, she admitted, had always labeled Marvin as emotional, dramatic, overly sensitive, but Anna revealed something colder. Marvin lived with a constant fear that Motown was monitoring him, manipulating him, punishing him for wanting true creative control. And for years, she reassured him, not because she believed he was wrong, but because she knew he was right. Then came the confession no one expected. Anna said she had covered for Motown. She admitted destroying letters Marvin wrote, accusing the label of withholding royalties. She admitted intercepting calls from lawyers Marvin hired in 1972 to challenge his contracts. She admitted hiding a check he wrote to a private investigator he wanted to hire to dig into Motown's accounting. She even admitted talking him out of a meeting with a civil rights attorney who had offered to help renegotiate his deals. She insisted she hadn't done it out of cruelty. She did it because she feared retaliation, that Motown would crush his career if he pushed too hard. In trying to shield him from one kind of damage, she had deepened another. As she dug deeper into the box, the secrets grew darker. She produced a 1975 letter addressed to her but never mailed, found crumpled behind a drawer. It was written during Marvin's time hiding in Hawaii. The handwriting was crooked, uneven. The words trembled on the page. In that letter, Marvin begged to be free from the marriage, the contracts, the debts, the expectations, the lies. Anna had never shown the letter to anyone. She kept it hidden because she didn't want the world to see what it truly revealed. Marvin wasn't just unstable, he was broken. But the most shocking revelation came near the end. Anna admitted that in March 1984, just weeks before the shooting, Marvin had appeared at her door without warning. He was thin, trembling, on edge, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and a notebook. He sat on her couch in silence for almost an hour. Then he opened the notebook and handed it to her. The pages were filled with erratic handwriting, messy sketches, crossed-out numbers, scattered phrases of fear. In that notebook, Marvin laid out everything he believed in those final weeks. That he was being targeted. That someone was still manipulating his finances. That Motown had never truly let him go, even after he left the label. That his father was being used by fate, by circumstance, by something to deliver an ending no one would question, and that his death would solve problems for other people. Anna kept the notebook. She placed it in the wooden box. She never showed it to police. She never shared it with the rest of the family. In her personal notes, she wrote that the contents terrified her. At 92, she finally admitted she believed Marvin had sensed that some kind of end was coming, not necessarily at his father's hands, but as the inevitable conclusion of a spiral that had been set in motion long before. Her final confession landed like a quiet verdict. She believed Marvin's death was not just a family tragedy, but the last chapter in a long punishment. She said Motown had used him, drained him, boxed him in, and she had played a role at every stage. She loved him, she said, but she controlled him. She supported him, but she silenced him. She protected him, but she bound him to the very machine that was breaking him. As she spoke, tears slid down her cheeks, and she whispered a line she had never allowed herself to say aloud. Marvin didn't start dying in 1984. He started dying the moment he lost control of his own life. When Anna closed the box for the final time, her hands shook from age and guilt. She did not just seal away a lifetime of secrets. She left behind a question that still hangs over the industry, unanswered. If Marvin Gaye's final days were shaped by fear, manipulation, and buried truths, how much of his life was ever really his own? And how many other artists were swallowed by the same machine? If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name